On the eve of Thanksgiving, 1971, a man wearing a black suit and a calm smile stepped aboard Flight 305 from Portland to Seattle. He called himself Dan Cooper. No one knew that within an hour he would vanish into a storm and into American legend. At 2:50 p.m., Northwest Orient Flight 305 took off carrying 36 passengers and 6 crew. Cooper ordered a bourbon and soda, lit a cigarette, and waited. Minutes later, he handed a note to flight attendant Florence Schaffner. She barely glanced at it until he leaned closer and whispered, "Miss, you better read that. I have a bomb." He wasn't angry, wasn't nervous, just controlled. His demands were simple: $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting in Seattle. The pilot radioed air traffic control. The FBI and local police scrambled. Cooper sat quietly, drinking and watching the storm clouds outside his window. What struck the crew most was not the bomb, it was the manner. Florence Schaffner later told investigators he was polite, unhurried. He wore clip-on sunglasses and spoke in a low, even voice. He did not threaten anyone beyond the note. He bought his own drink. He tipped. While agents scrambled on the ground, flight attendant Tina Mucklow sat beside him for hours. She would later say he seemed sorry, not for what he was doing, but that she had to be involved at all. He knew the plane, he knew the airline's procedures. When asked about the parachutes, he specified they had to be operational, not training chutes with sealed compartments. Whoever Cooper was, he had done his homework. At 5:46 p.m., Flight 305 touched down. Cooper allowed the passengers to leave unharmed. On the tarmac stood FBI agents with bags of cash and 4 parachutes. He accepted them and ordered the crew to take off again. Destination: Mexico City. His instructions were precise. Maintain altitude below 10,000 feet. Speed under 200 knots, flaps and gear down. The crew knew then this was no ordinary criminal. The FBI considered a tactical breach. They had agents on the tarmac positioned at the aircraft doors waiting for the order, but Cooper had chosen his seat at the rear of the plane deliberately. Any approach would be visible long before it reached him, and with the briefcase he claimed held a bomb, a claim no one on the ground could disprove. A forced entry put the remaining crew at direct risk. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was briefed in real time. The decision came down: comply. Hand over the money, let him go, get the crew home. So they waited, they paid, and they watched the plane climb back into the storm, tailed by 2 Air Force fighters flying at reduced speed through the dark, trying to track a man none of them could see. 8:13 p.m., a sudden jolt. The tail of the plane tilts upward. A warning light flashes in the cockpit. Rear stairs open. Cooper was gone. He had jumped into a freezing storm at night, wearing a business suit, a tie, and a raincoat. He carried a parachute and $200,000 in cash. No one would ever see him again. The jump zone, investigators later calculated, was somewhere over the Washougal River drainage. Dense forest, no roads, no lights below. The temperature outside the aircraft was below freezing. The wind, at that speed and altitude, would have hit him at close to 200 miles per hour. He had chosen a military surplus parachute, one of the 4 provided, over the civilian sports chute that was easier to steer. Investigators were never certain whether that was intentional or a mistake made in the dark. He was carrying roughly 21 pounds of bundled $20 bills. The FBI noted the rear air stair of the 727 was uniquely accessible in flight, a design flaw Boeing would quietly correct in the years that followed. By dawn, the largest manhunt in U.S. history was underway. 800 soldiers and police searched forests and riverbanks. They found nothing. No parachute, no money, no body. Weeks became months. The legend grew. People wondered if he had died in the cold or escaped into the wilderness. Then, in 1980, a boy digging in the sand along the Columbia River discovered 3 bundles of rotting $20 bills worth $5,800. The serial numbers matched the ransom money. It was the first real clue in 9 years, and it raised more questions than answers. The money was not scattered. It was bundled, still roughly in the original bank-wrapped packets, though badly degraded. Hydrologists and forensic geologists spent years studying how the bills arrived at that sandbar. The patterns of sediment and river flow suggested the money had not simply washed downstream from Cooper's landing zone, which led some analysts to conclude it had been buried, or stored, before erosion carried it into the river. Others argued the Columbia's shifting channels could account for it naturally. No more bills were ever found, despite dozens of organized searches and decades of amateur digs along the riverbank. The $194,000 that remained unaccounted for has never surfaced in any bank, any country, or any estate. Hundreds claim to be D.B. Cooper. Some were mentally unstable, others were con men chasing fame. But three names stood out to investigators: Richard Floyd McCoy, a former pilot who hijacked another plane months later with the same method. He was killed in a shootout. Kenneth Christensen, a quiet flight attendant with parachute training and a mysterious post-heist bank deposit. Robert Rackstraw, a Vietnam veteran with the skills and temperament to pull it off. He even teased reporters that he could be Cooper. Each case collapsed under evidence. The problem was never finding candidates, it was finding proof. No usable fingerprints were recovered from the aircraft. The physical description, mid-40s, medium build, dark hair, olive complexion, matched tens of thousands of men in the Pacific Northwest alone. The sketch produced from crew testimony was competent, but generic enough to fit a generation of American men who had served in the military. The ransom bills had been photographed and their serial numbers recorded before handover, a standard precaution. But spending marked money requires either ignorance or a very long patience. None of the bills ever appeared in circulation. Not one transaction in any country was ever traced back to the ransom. In 2016, the FBI closed the investigation. After 45 years, they still had no name and no body. D.B. Cooper was a criminal to some, a folk hero to others. He became a symbol of freedom and mystery in an age of control. Bars, songs, and films carry his name. Each year, people gather in Washington state to celebrate the man who outwitted the FBI and disappeared without a trace. The case remains the only unsolved skyjacking in American history. The FBI received thousands of letters about the case over the decades. Tips, theories, confessions, accusations. What made Cooper different from other fugitives was the absence of malice. No one was hurt, no shots were fired. The crew of Flight 305 were released safely. In the public imagination, he became something closer to a puzzle than a criminal. Just a man who asked a straightforward question of the system and simply walked away before it could answer. Criminologists note that the case sits at an unusual intersection. Technically sophisticated, emotionally detached, and completely without sequel. Whoever Cooper was, he never tried it again. Maybe he died in that storm. Maybe he landed safely and started over, living quietly under a new name. Whatever the truth, one fact remains. D.B. Cooper boarded a plane as a man and jumped as a myth. The name D.B. Cooper was a mistake, a wire service error in the hours after the hijacking that attached a stranger's name to a man who had never given his own. He called himself Dan Cooper. The FBI added the DB, the press ran with it, and the name stuck to a face no one had photographed, a background no one had traced, a man who stepped off a plane into open sky and left only questions behind. Somewhere, in a grave or a quiet house, in a life no one ever thought to look at twice, the real man kept that secret. He took it through decades the FBI spent searching, through every theory, every suspect, every newspaper front page that carried a name that was never his.